Section 1. The tolling in the Fogget was on the dreariest of December nights, the fog thick as lamb's wool, that the bell first rang out. I remember the moment well, for Holmes and I had been sitting before the hearth in our Baker Street lodgings, lulled into drowsiness by the clatter of coals and the melodic drumming of the rain upon the window panes. I had been leafing through the Times, the events of the day passing without note parliamentary squabbles, a minor banking collapse, and the inconsequential marriage of a Scottish viscount to an American heiress, when Holmes, who had been reclined, with his pipe in hand, stiffened and leaned forward, his head cocked toward the window. "Listen, Watson," he said. I set the paper down. "I hear only the rain." "No," he murmured. There it is again." A faint clang echoed from somewhere beyond the reach of Baker Street's fogged windows. Hollow, metallic, and almost mournful, it rang a second time, and then, after a breathless pause, a third. "A bell?" I asked, frowning. "Precisely," Holmes replied. He rose from his chair, all fatigue vanished. "3 tolls. Not a church bell, nor a handbell. Larger than the former, smaller than the latter. It is old, I think, and infrequently used." He stepped to the window, brushing aside the curtain with his long fingers. The fog was so dense I could not see even the lamp on the corner, let alone the street beyond. "A curious hour for such a sound," I said, and an even curiouser tone. Holmes said nothing at first, only stood listening, his eyes alight. Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached for his dressing-gown and violin case. "You may want your revolver, Watson." "My revolver? You mean to investigate it now?" "I suspect the bell was not merely ornamental," Holmes said, already halfway down the stairs. "Someone rang it deliberately, and in so doing set something in motion." I had long since abandoned questioning Holmes in these moods, when his mind latched onto a thread invisible to the rest of the world. I fetched my coat and revolver, and within minutes we were descending the steps of 221B into the sodden hush of the London night. The fog swallowed us at once. Baker Street was barely recognizable, its cobblestones glistening like wet slate beneath the gas lamps. Holmes moved with swift certainty, turning left toward Marylebone, and then doubling back through a narrow alley that exited onto Clarence Square. The bells had ceased by then, but he pressed on, weaving through empty carriages and slumbering Holmes until we reached a tall, ivy-covered wall, the boundary of St. Dunstan's Seminary for boys. "The bell originated here," he said, pointing to the steeple barely visible in the mist above us. "St. Dunstan's Chapel. The bell has not rung since the seminary was shuttered." "Shuttered?" I said. "I wasn't aware. 2 years ago, a fire in the West Wing. Most of the boys relocated to another parish. The structure was deemed unsafe." He withdrew a small lantern from his pocket and produced a thin lockpick. Within seconds, the wrought iron gate creaked open, and we slipped into the overgrown courtyard. The seminary loomed before us, an austere Victorian edifice of dark stone, its windows like empty eye sockets. Ivy clung in limp tendrils from the buttresses, and the ancient bell tower reached like a finger into the fog. We circled to the rear, where a short stair led down into the chapel cloisters. The heavy oaken doors had rotted at the hinges and stood ajar. Holmes pushed one open slowly. The interior beyond was swallowed in shadow. "Stay close," he murmured. We stepped into the chapel, the air thick with dust and damp. Pews sat in, uneven rows. Some collapsed under their own weight. A great iron chandelier hung at a drunken angle from the ceiling. Beyond the altar, a stone arch framed the foot of the bell tower. Holmes raised the lantern and strode forward. There, beneath the bell pull, lay a man. He was slumped against the base of the stone pillar, legs sprawled awkwardly, head tilted to the side. His eyes were open, but empty. A smear of blood darkened his temple, and his left hand clutched a folded scrap of paper. Holmes knelt beside the body, his expression unreadable. "Still warm," he said. "Dead less than an hour." I crouched beside him. The man was dressed in formal evening wear, though it was disheveled and damp. A signet ring bearing the crest of a lion and cross gleamed on his finger. Holmes gently took the paper from the dead man's hand and unfolded it. The lantern's glow revealed a single line, written in a jagged, hurried scrawl. The bell tolled once for honor, twice for guilt, and thrice for the blood debt. Holmes read it aloud, then looked up slowly. "At me. Well, Watson," he said softly, "it appears we are summoned not only by sound but by mystery. I felt a chill, and it was not from the cold. Who is he?" Holmes examined the ring. "The crust belongs to the family Marshalsea, a noble line minor aristocracy, though long established. Sir Reginald Marshalsea is the current patriarch. This is not him. Perhaps a son? Or a brother? We'll confirm soon enough." He rose and walked the perimeter of the chapel, his eyes darting from crack to shadow. He stopped beneath a stained glass window of St. Bartholomew and touched the sill. His fingers came away, blackened with soot. "There was a fire here, as the report said," he murmured, "but it was contained before reaching the tower." "What are you thinking?" I asked. "That whoever called us here, whoever rang the bell, wanted the body to be found. The tolling was a summons, and the note a riddle." At that moment a distant clatter echoed from above, the creak of floorboards, perhaps, or a footfall in the tower. We froze. Holmes extinguished the lantern. "Someone else is here." Silence, then another creak. Closer. Holmes moved swiftly, gliding along the edge of the pews. I followed, revolver in hand. We reached the base of the tower stairs just as a shadow slipped through the arch above and vanished into the mist. Holmes gave chase at once, and I after him. We burst through the chapel doors into the courtyard. A shape darted through the fog, cloaked, hunched, then disappeared down the eastern path. Holmes stopped short. "No use," he muttered. "They know these grounds." He turned to me. "We'll not catch them tonight." I nodded grimly. "Then what next?" Holmes looked back toward the chapel. We returned with Lestrade. "This is no longer just an odd tolling in the night. A man is dead. A message was delivered, and someone wanted to ensure we heard it." He tapped the folded note in his pocket. "The bell tolled thrice, Watson, for the blood debt. The question is, whose?" Section 2. The mark of Marshalsea. The morning after our strange midnight encounter dawned gray and unkind. The fog of the previous evening had not lifted so much as thickened into a dull wetness that clung to every sill and awning across Baker Street. I awoke to the clink of breakfast dishes and the faint rustle of newspaper pages, and upon descending the stairs, I found Holmes already dressed, tea untouched, his long fingers busy with a sheaf of documents spread across the sitting-room table. "You're early at work," I said, noting the reddish circles beneath his eyes. "Have you not slept?" He looked up, eyes sharp. "Sleep, Watson, is an indulgence best enjoyed when death is not pressing at one's shoulder." He gestured to the table. "Our man from last night was not, as I first suspected, a brother of Sir Reginald Marshalsea. He was his nephew Edward Marshalsea, 37 years old, bachelor, and junior solicitor in the family firm of Marshalsea and Ventnor." Holmes tapped a folder. "Scotland Yard confirmed his identity an hour ago. Lestrade is investigating. As well, though, as expected, he suspects a botched robbery." "You disagree?" I asked, pouring myself tea. "Wholeheartedly. There was no sign of a struggle, no stolen items, no forced entry. The death was clean, a blunt force blow to the skull. And then there's the note." He lifted it between two fingers. "The bell tolled once for honor, twice for guilt, and thrice for the blood debt. It reads like an incantation, symbolic, calculated. It speaks not to impulse, but ritual." I sat across from him. "Do you think Edward Marshalsea was involved in some clandestine society? Like the Freemasons?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That would be far too mundane." He rose and began pacing the room. "The Marshalseas have long been regarded as guardians of certain ecclesiastical artifacts. A peculiar occupation for nobility, wouldn't you say? I found records this morning indicating that the seminary where Edward was found, St. Dunstan's, was founded by Reginald's grandfather in 1849. It was said to house the Bell of Penance, a medieval relic retrieved during the dissolution of the monasteries." "The bell that rang last night?" "Undoubtedly, though most assumed it had been lost in the fire." He turned toward the window, folding his arms. "Now we know otherwise." A knock at the door interrupted our musings. Mrs. Hudson's voice preceded the visitor. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes." The inspector entered, his boots damp and his expression tired. "Morning, gents. Thought I'd best pay a call before the coroner hauls off the body." Holmes offered him tea, which he declined. "I take it you've read the report?" Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded. "And I've no doubt you have your own theory." Lestrade sighed, sinking into a chair. "It's odd, I'll grant you. But if you ask me, the man knew his killer. Trusted him. There was no fight. No theft. Maybe a lover's quarrel gone wrong. The note could be dramatic nonsense meant to throw us off." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And the bell?" Lestrade grimaced. "A stunt to get attention or spook the neighbors." Holmes didn't argue. He simply picked up his violin and plucked the strings absently. "And you've spoken to the Marshalseas?" "And you've spoken to the Marshalseas?" "I have," Lestrade said. "Sir Reginald is not pleased. Blames the press. Blames you, if I'm honest. I do tend to attract suspicion from noble families," Holmes mused. "He says Edward was troubled. Took long walks at night. Suffered from nerves. Useful excuse for odd behavior," Holmes murmured. "But hardly one for death in a derelict chapel." Lestrade stood. "I know that look. You're going to poke around again." "Of course." The inspector offered a dry smile. "Just don't disturb the scene too much. I've got a headache already." With that he departed. Holmes returned to his desk and consulted a small map of Clerkenwell. "There's a Marshalsea estate on Redfern Lane," he said, "and the seminary's property once stretched nearly to its gates. I suspect they're connected historically and perhaps conspiratorially." "You believe Edward found something?" "I believe Edward remembered something," Holmes said, "and that memory got him killed." Within the hour we found ourselves aboard a rattling cab headed to Clerkenwell. The ride was somber, the streets blanketed in soot and drizzle. As we drew near Redfern Lane, the urban grime gave way to gated stone buildings and long iron fences. The Marshalsea estate, when we arrived, was an imposing structure along Georgian facade with ivy-covered columns and a severe portico. A butler in a stiff collar admitted us, his face expressionless. "Sir Reginald is in the conservatory." We were ushered through high-ceilinged corridors into a warm glass chamber filled with overgrown ferns and pale winter roses. Sir Reginald Marshalsea stood near a marble statue, arms crossed, his hawkish features set with irritation. "Mr. Holmes," he said coldly, "I had hoped your reputation for discretion was more than idle flattery. I assure you, Sir Reginald, I seek only truth, and your nephew appears to have died seeking the same." The older man's jaw tightened. Edward was weak, melancholic, too sensitive for the world. Holmes did not blink. Did he have enemies? None. His work was dull, his life quieter still. And the seminary? Did he ever mention returning there? Reginald's eyes narrowed. "He was forbidden." Holmes smiled thinly. "By you? By me. There are ghosts there. My father's obsessions infected that place." "Obsessions?" The older man turned toward the roses. He believed the bell had power, that ringing it under the moon brought clarity, madness more like. Holmes's eyes glittered. Did he pass that belief to Edward? Reginald did not answer. Holmes stepped closer. "Sir Reginald, your silence may preserve family dignity. But I assure you it will not hinder the truth." The nobleman sighed. Edward believed the bell could expose sin. Ridiculous, of course. He claimed he was tormented by visions. Said he saw things at night. Heard voices in the cloister. I thought he was slipping. What kind of voices? Names. Warnings. He kept journals. I burned them, Holmes stilled. Why? To preserve his dignity. You may have burned his warning, Holmes replied. Reginald did not respond. Holmes turned to go. Thank you for your time. Outside the rain had quickened. He's lying. I said once we were clear of the estate. About many things, Holmes replied. But the most telling was the one thing he would not say. And what was that? That the bell rang at midnight, not to warn the dead, but to summon the living. Section 3, the chapel ledger. The evening mist had thickened as we returned to St. Dunstan's Seminary. London's gas lamps glowed like ghostly sentinels through the soupy veil that hung low over the crooked rooftops and cobbled lanes. The wrought iron gate creaked under Holmes's gloved hand as we re-entered the crumbling grounds, where weeds and ivy had long since overrun the carefully laid stone paths of the once sacred seminary. St. Dunstan's, and the growing dark appeared, more mausoleum than sanctuary. Its fractured windows were like blackened eyes watching us approach, and the scorched tower loomed above as though scorning our return. Holmes paused just before the chapel doors and inhaled deeply, as though tasting the air for its secrets. The scent remains, he murmured. Cinders, damp ash, but beneath it, cedar wood. A candle burned here recently, likely within the past day. You think someone came after Edward Marshalsea's death? I asked, gripping my coat tighter against the rising chill. More. Likely someone never left, he said, pushing open the chapel door. We stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet, echoing hollowly through the nave. Dust floated thick in the lantern light Holmes held aloft, and the ruined pews, some splintered, others blackened, gave the entire place the appearance of a war-torn. Relic. Holmes moved with a quiet reverence, scanning every surface as though listening for silent confession. He moved to the pulpit where a layer of grime had been disturbed recently. Someone leaned here, he observed. Likely to observe, not to speak. I glanced around. Do you think Edward came here often? I think he visited more than once, Holmes said, and he was not alone. He led me to the rear of the chapel, past the altar and through a rotted wooden door that hung slightly ajar the entrance to the sacristy. Inside, the small stone chamber felt even colder, the walls sweating with old moisture. A moth-eaten tapestry hung limp in the corner, barely covering a series of alcoves carved into the wall niches that had once held relics. Now long removed or plundered. At the center stood a time-darkened desk, its surface buried beneath ancient ledgers, torn parchment, and a scattering of blackened wax from candles long since extinguished. Holmes moved forward with delicacy, lifting the top ledger and brushing aside decades of dust. These are the records, he muttered, flipping pages with precise fingers. Parish accounts, birth and death registries, maintenance logs. He paused, finger resting on a brittle page marked with ornate handwriting. Here, April 1872. Listen closely. He read aloud, restoration of the bell tower approved. Bell transported from Norfolk, said to be of pre-dissolution make. Affixed with Latin inscription, Quis est innocens? Who is innocent? I translated softly. Holmes nodded. Not exactly the sort of question one expects from a church bell. More like a challenge, I said, studying the page. Who brought it here? He scanned lower. Installed per request of donor. Patron's name withheld. Order of installation made to match cloister alignment. Concealed pull installed. Usage restricted to rite of contrition. What sort of rite? Holmes's eyes narrowed. One not found in any Anglican liturgy. He flipped forward 2 pages and drew our attention to a short handwritten note, scribbled in the margin darker ink. A less practiced hand. Armin insists bell must not ring without worthy hand. If it tolls in error, the blood debt awakens. Armam. I said, Reginald Marshalsea? Possibly, Holmes replied, though I believe it refers to his father, Rowan Marshalsea, the family patriarch, a man rumored to have indulged in esoteric theology and arcane rites. I glanced about uneasily. What sort of place was this seminary? Not merely a school, Holmes said, voice low. It was a proving ground, a sanctum, perhaps even a court, but not one of earthly jurisdiction. He turned and moved to a wall where a worn tapestry hung askew. Behind it, a rusted grate was bolted into the stone. With some effort, Holmes pried the grate free and revealed a narrow descending corridor, a tunnel hewn of stone and shadow. Bring the lantern, he said, and we stepped down together. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for one man. and the air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of mold, old stone, and something faintly metallic. The steps ended at a vaulted crypt-round, hollow and eerily still. In the center stood an old lectern, partially collapsed from time but still upright. On it rested a bell small forged of black iron and etched with the same words as before, Quis est innocens? I reached out instinctively, and the moment my fingers brushed its cold surface, it resonated with a faint hum, like a whispered accusation. Holmes examined the base. "See this slot?" he said. "A chain once hung here. A ceremonial tolling device, perhaps, but it's gone." Behind the lectern, illuminated by the flickering lantern, stood a stone wall carved with names, many of them familiar. "Marshalsea?" I whispered. "Ventnor, Alderton, Braithwaite." Next to each name were marks, crosses, some single, some double, some triple-lined. Many bore none. "Edward Marshalsea," Holmes said, pointing near the top. "Recently added 3 marks. 1 for honor," I recalled. 2 for guilt. 3 for the blood debt," Holmes finished. "He judged himself, or someone judged him, and carried out the sentence?" Holmes stepped back, surveying the names. "Watson, this is no ordinary death. This is a legacy of justice, ancient, secret, and lethal." I was about to respond when a sudden gust of air pushed through the tunnel behind us, extinguishing the lantern's flame. As we descended, the heavy front doors opened with a low groan, revealing a man who looked as though he had stepped directly from the last century. He was tall and skeletal, his face pale and deeply lined, and his clothing immaculately preserved, though of an unmistakably outdated style. "You are expected," he intoned without so much as an introduction. Holmes tipped his hat. "Ramsden, I presume." The man did not blink. "Follow me." We entered into a cavernous foyer whose walls were lined with portraits of long dead Marshalseas, each more severe and hollow-eyed than the last. There was no carpet to soften our steps, only cold flagstone beneath our boots and the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock echoing through the silence. Holmes's gaze darted around the chamber. "No signs of recent habitation," he muttered under his breath. "And yet the hearth is warm." Ramsden led us down a dim corridor, where the gas lamps burned with a sickly yellow light, and the smell of damp wood and old incense hung heavy in the air. "You will be quartered in the east wing," he said. "Breakfast is served at 7. The master does not receive visitors before noon." "Curious custom for someone who summoned us," Holmes remarked. But Ramsden had already turned and disappeared into the gloom. The rooms were as Clara had described them, large, shadowy spaces, adorned with high curtained windows, dusty four-posters, and antique furniture left in a state of somber dignity. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and faint stains marked the wood around the fireplace, as though time itself had left behind a bruise. Holmes wasted no time. As I settled my bag near the bed, he moved about the chamber with the energy of a cat set loose in a new hunting ground. He ran his fingers along the mantel, examined the floorboards for signs of recent movement, and crouched to study a faint set of scuff marks near the door. "We are being observed," he said at last. "But not openly. They want to see how we behave before they show themselves." He stood, dusted his hands, and crossed to the desk in the corner. On it sat a small black volume bound in what looked suspiciously like leather too supple for common use. The spine bore no title. Holmes opened it cautiously. Inside, handwritten in an elegant and slanted hand, were a series of entries dated decades prior. Sermons, rituals, references to the doctrine of tolling. The text grew increasingly erratic as it progressed, sentences scratched out and rewritten, words underlined with obsessive fervor. "It's a ledger," Holmes murmured, "and a confession, written in the hand of Rowan Marshalsea himself. He showed me one entry dated November 3rd, 1876. He has rung the bell thrice. The sin is known, and thus I must bear the toll. Let the hand strike at midnight, when the sins of blood cry loudest. No absolution without reckoning. The ritual cannot be silenced, only delayed." Before I could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Clara peeked inside, her face pale. "There's something you should see in the drawing room," she said. We followed her through a narrow hall into what must once have been the heart of the home. The drawing room had the air of a place. Forgotten furniture covered in linen shrouds, the fireplace long cold. But upon the mantel, someone had recently placed 3 framed photographs. Holmes approached, his brows knitting. The first was Rowan Marshalsea, stern and angular, with eyes like dark glass. The second was Edward, familiar and noble of bearing, even in his youth. The third was a child, perhaps 8 or 9, a boy we had never seen before. He bore a passing resemblance to Edward, though his eyes were lighter and his smile unsettling. "Who is he?" I asked. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I thought there were only 2 sons." Holmes examined the back of the photograph. It bore a name, written in faded ink. "Thaddeus." "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "we have found the ghost in the family tree." "What does that mean?" "It means there was another heir," Holmes said, "one erased from the official narrative. And if he is still alive, it changes everything." Before we could discuss it further, the clock struck noon. A heavy knock echoed through the hallway. Ramsden appeared again, this time holding a silver tray upon which rested 3 black envelopes. "Master requests your presence," he said, "at midnight. The threshold room." He handed each of us an envelope and departed without a word. Holmes opened his immediately. Inside was a single card. "The toll has been struck. The blood remembers. The hour of reckoning draws near." Holmes looked up, his voice low and grave. "We are being summoned, Watson, not for conversation, but for judgment." Clara's hands trembled as she held her envelope. She didn't open it. "I remember the threshold room," she said. "It's not on any of the maps of the house. But once, when I was very young, I followed Edward through the hall, beyond the chapel. He opened a narrow door behind the statue of St. Matthias. It led down to a crypt, I guessed," she nodded. "We didn't go far. He turned back after a minute. He said it didn't feel right, like something was breathing down there." Holmes's face was grim. "Then tonight we descend." As the light dimmed and the sky grew heavy with rain, Holmes began preparations in earnest. He borrowed oil lanterns from the cellar, packed a satchel with a pistol, spare bullets, and a length of rope. I armed myself as well reluctantly, but prudently. At precisely midnight, the clock began to chime dot. We stood together in the upper hall, the 3 of us silent as the final toll rang out. Holmes turned to us and said, "This house is not haunted, Watson. It is inhabited by ritual, by memory, and by a darkness not of the supernatural, but of the soul. Then he opened the door and led us into the shadows beyond. Section 6. The threshold room midnight hung like a blade over Blackthorn Hall, its edge drawn along the skin of silence. Outside, the rain had begun to fall lightly at first, then steadily, a cold and constant drumming against the windows. The sound seemed to heighten the stillness within, amplifying every creak of floorboard and distant groan of settling stone. Holmes led the way, lantern in hand, the flame trembling against the walls like a prisoner's breath. Clara followed closely behind, her face pale but composed, the black envelope still unopened in her hand. I brought up the rear, my revolver discreetly tucked in my coat pocket. My heart thudding in time with our footsteps, we descended the main staircase into the rear corridor of the house, then turned toward the chapel. As we passed the drawing room, the portraits on the walls seemed to lean inward slightly, as though the Marshalsea ancestors themselves were watching our passage with silent anticipation. At the far end of the corridor, just before the chapel door, Holmes stopped and turned to Clara. "You're certain of what you saw?" he asked. "The statue of St. Matthias?" Clara nodded. "It was years ago, but I remember the way Edward moved it, just slightly, to the left. There's a panel hidden in the base." Holmes examined the statue with great care. It was a tall figure in robes, holding a great iron-bound book, and a broken axe, his martyr's symbol. The base was octagonal and cracked in several places. Holmes ran his hands along the edge until he found a groove, then applied gentle pressure. With him, a soft grind of stone on stone, the panel shifted. Behind it lay a wooden door, nearly lost in shadow. Its surface bore no handle, no markings, only the faint indentation of a bell in the upper center. Holmes reached forward and pressed against it. The door swung inward with an eerie groan, revealing a narrow staircase plunging into darkness. "We descend," he said, lifting his lantern. The stairs were steep and winding, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. Damp air clung to our skin as we moved lower, the scent of earth and mildew growing stronger. At the bottom, the passage widened into a corridor lined with thick wooden beams. Mold crept along the edges, and tiny rivulets of water trickled along. The stone floor. After some distance, we arrived at a rusted gate. Holmes tested it. It was unlocked. Beyond lay a vaulted chamber, round and windowless, lit only by a single brazier in the center. Its walls were carved with strange symbols, bells, flames, and what looked like eyes, hundreds of them, etched in irregular spirals. "This is it," Clara whispered. "The threshold room." In the center of the chamber stood a stone plinth, upon which rested a second bell larger than the one in the chapel, yet smaller than the great St. Dunstan's bell. It was made of black iron and bore a series of runes around its base. Holmes approached it cautiously. "There's something ceremonial about this," he said. "See here the grooves worn into the floor around the pedestal? This bell has been rung many times." Clara stepped forward and ran a finger over the nearest etching. "I remember when my uncle died, Edward told me he heard the bell ring. Once at midnight, just once, and that was how he knew the old man was dead." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A death knell? A family tradition? Or something more? He turned back to the chamber and began examining its walls in detail. Along one side he discovered a low bench carved into the stone above it, a set of hooks, now empty. A rusted chain hung from one, and a single black robe remained folded neatly below. "I believe this was once a place of judgment," Holmes murmured. "Not a chapel, an inner sanctum, reserved for rites passed from generation to generation. And this," he pointed to a groove running from the plinth to a small hole in the wall. We froze in the pitch dark. I heard at the faint creak of something above. Then a dull clang. The bell in the chapel. It had rung again. Holmes relit the lantern with practiced haste and ushered us back up the passage. We emerged into the sacristy, just as a second toll reverberated through the chapel's cracked dome. Holmes threw open the door and sprinted into the nave. No one. The bell was still swinging. Slow and deliberate. Clang, clang, clang. Holmes. Single quotes. SIs swept the space. No wind, no mechanism. Someone rang it by hand. We raced to the rear stair that led to the belfry, an ancient spiral staircase of iron and dust. Holmes took the steps 2 at a time, lantern bouncing shadows along the stone at the top. The room was empty. The bell swung gently on its beam. A length of twine hung from the ringer, cut clean through. Holmes knelt and picked up a small object from the floor. A signet button, gilded, ornate. He handed it to me. The Marshalsea crest. Someone had been there, within. Moments of our arrival and vanished. Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. "They're watching," he said quietly. "Not from afar, from here. Someone in the family, someone steeped in this tradition. The murderer, or the next judge." Section 4, the Marshalsea manuscript. The rain came in soft sheets as we left St. Dunstan's behind, its dark silhouette receding into the mist like a ghost fading into the folds of night. Holmes remained unusually quiet as our carriage rumbled along the slick cobbles of Clerkenwell. He sat with one leg crossed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unfixed, yet wholly absorbed in thought. I had known him long enough to recognize the signs, the quiet before the storm, the hum of a mind rapidly assembling 1,000 disparate fragments into a cohesive whole. Yet something in his expression gave me pause, an unfamiliar tightness at the corners of his mouth, a shadow behind the eyes. "What is it, Holmes?" I finally asked. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging the cold window. The bell was rung. "Again, Watson," he said, "and not by chance. It was a message directed not at the world, but at us. A challenge, more a provocation, and the relic left behind the Marshalsea button was a deliberate breadcrumb. Someone wants us to follow the trail, but not too quickly. And Edward's death?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "Still a consequence, but perhaps not the first, nor the last." We arrived back at Baker Street shortly before midnight. Mrs. Hudson met us with a worried glance, but Holmes brushed her aside with a polite murmur. He strode immediately to his desk, flicked on the lamp, and withdrew a series of folders from the cabinet marked Private Correspondence. "These are clippings and notes I've kept on the Marshalsea family over the years," he explained as he laid the papers before us. "Whispers of disputes, unproven accusations, and one particularly intriguing anecdote." He passed me a yellowed envelope. Inside was a torn page from an 1883 edition of The Strand, containing a short obituary. Rowan Marshalsea, former deacon and headmaster of St. Dunstan's Seminary, dies under mysterious circumstances at family estate in Hampshire. Rumors of illness are contested by locals who claim to have seen strange lights and heard the toll of a church bell on the night of his passing. The Marshalsea family refused post-mortem examination. No cause of death listed. No bell exists at the Hampshire estate, I noted. So what did they hear? Holmes tapped the page. That, my friend, is what I intend to find out. He crossed to the bookshelf and removed a thick volume, leather-bound and weathered, with no title upon its spine. He opened it reverently and turned several pages until stopping at a heading that read, "The Marshalsea Manuscript, a private publication," he explained, "printed in limited numbers in 1869. I obtained this copy some years ago from a collector in Vienna. It's a collection of theological musings, genealogical accounts, and most importantly, doctrinal deviations." Deviations? Holmes nodded. The elder Marshalsea believed that true contrition required not only confession, but penance. And penance, in his view, could only be achieved through judgment, administered not by God alone, but by man chosen, sanctified, bound by lineage. He turned the book toward me. This chapter outlines the doctrine of the tolling hand, a belief that when a member of the Marshalsea line sins grievously, it is the responsibility of another within the bloodline to toll the bell of reckoning. The toll is meant to awaken judgment, both spiritual and, in their tradition, mortal. I stared at the page, stunned. So the bell is not merely symbolic. No, Holmes said. It is a ritual tool, a summons to judgment. The moment Edward rang that bell, someone responded, perhaps not immediately, but inevitably. He moved to the window, gazing out at the slick rooftops. What we are dealing with, Watson, is not merely a murder, but a centuries-old covenant one that has, until now, remained hidden beneath the facade of religious duty. Just then a knock sounded at the door. We exchanged a glance. Holmes gestured for me to remain seated as he crossed the room and opened it cautiously. A young woman stood on the threshold, her face pale and eyes wide with anxiety. Her dress was soaked through, and a veil hung loosely from her bonnet. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stepped aside. "Come in, miss." "Clara Ventnor," she said, stepping into the warmth with a visible shiver. I know you're investigating Edward's death. I didn't know where else to go." "Please, sit," Holmes said, offering her a blanket. "You are related to the Ventnors of Marshalsea ancestry?" "Yes, Edward and we were cousins. But he confided in me more than anyone else, especially after he returned from America." Holmes poured her tea. "And what troubles you, Miss Ventnor?" She took a moment to compose herself, then drew a folded letter from her coat pocket. She handed it to Holmes. "He sent me this the day before he died." Holmes unfolded the paper carefully and read aloud. "Clara, if you are reading this, I may already have passed the threshold. I have uncovered truths that our family buried, truths soaked in blood and silence. The bell at St. Dunstan's is not just metal, it is a voice, a call to the old rites. I am no saint, Clara. I have done things that haunt me, but I must know if redemption is possible, or if judgment will take me. I will ring the bell. If it claims me, know that I went willingly. If it does not, then I will need your help to end this cycle. Tell no one but Holmes. Your cousin." It wore a heavy silence fell over the room. Miss Ventnor's hands trembled slightly. He believed someone in the family was still upholding the old ways. He suspected. Reginald. Reginald Marshalsea? I asked. His own brother? He changed after their father died, Clara said. Became withdrawn, obsessive. He took over the estate and cut ties with most of the family. Edward said he found old texts, their ledgers, chants, instructions. He feared Reginald had embraced the doctrine. Fully, Holmes leaned back, fingers pressed together. "This confirms it, Watson," he said. Edward's death was not murder by motive, but by mandate. The bell was tolled, and judgment carried out. He turned to Clara. "Where is Reginald now?" "He's returned to the Hampshire estate," she said. "After the funeral, he disappeared. No one's seen him for days." Holmes's eyes lit with cold fire. "Then that is where we go next." Section 5, the house on Blackthorn Hill. Expanded. The road to Hampshire grew narrower as we pushed deeper into the countryside, the trees thickening on either side like a dense curtain, closing slowly upon us. Dawn had scarcely broken, but already the sky wore a slate-gray shroud. The coach wheels crunched over frost-stiffened leaves, and from time to time a hawthorn branch scraped against the glass, as if the woods themselves meant to discourage trespass. Inside the coach, Clara Ventnor sat quietly, her hands gloved and clenched in her lap, eyes focused, not on the passing scenery, but somewhere within her own tangled thoughts. She had barely spoken since our departure. Beside me, Holmes remained motionless, eyes half closed, head tilted slightly against the side of the carriage. He was not asleep, I could tell by the occasional twitch of his fingers or the faint tightening around his mouth, that his mind was humming with possibilities. "Blackthorn Hall," Holmes murmured at last, without opening his eyes. "A name. My name." With all the cheer of a gallows prayer. "Tell me, Miss Ventnor, what should we expect upon arrival?" Clara looked up, startled. I don't know. I haven't been there since my uncle's funeral. Reginald was never fond of guests, and after my father's passing, I severed what remained of our connection. Edward's visits became rare, and his letters more cryptic. "Did your family often speak of the house in any particular terms?" Holmes asked. "Its history? Its peculiarities?" "There were whispers," she said hesitantly, "of sealed rooms and strange rites. My mother used to warn us never to go near the west wing. She called it the Shadow Hall, but I thought it only superstition, meant to frighten children. Superstitions are often the residue of truth," Holmes replied, "distilled through generations until only fear remains." The coach slowed as we ascended a final hill, and suddenly the house came into view. Blackthorn Hall stood like a mausoleum atop the rise, its blackened stone facade choked with ivy, its tall windows vacant as eyes long gouged of sight. Mist coiled in the garden below, thick as graveyard fog. Two tall chimneys coughed plumes of gray smoke into the sky, and a single flickering light burned behind a shuttered upper window. "A drainage channel," he said grimly. "Not for water, I suspect." Clara turned away, visibly shaken. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "you think they used this room for sacrifices?" "Perhaps not in the literal sense," he replied. "But symbolically, certainly, bloodletting of some kind. A rite of passage, a reckoning." He stepped closer to the bell and peered beneath its base. "There's something carved here," he said. "Help me lift it." With some effort, we raised the bell enough for Holmes to retrieve a small, sealed tin box hidden beneath. He opened. It carefully dot inside lay a bundle of documents, brittle and yellowed with age. Holmes lifted the top sheet and began to read aloud. Confession of Edward Marshalsea, dated March 11th, 1893. He scanned further, his eyes narrowing. It's a letter addressed to Reginald. He speaks of guilt, of a death, of someone called Thaddeus. That name again, I said. The boy in the photograph. Holmes nodded. Listen to this. He would not stop ringing it, Reginald. Not even after we begged him. Father said the bell could only be tolled with pure intent, but Thaddeus laughed. He said he'd found a new way to be remembered. And then the fire. There are scorch marks on this page. He continues. I tried to save him, but the flame took hold so quickly. I still see his face in my dreams. That grin, that last scream. You told me it was an accident, but I know it wasn't. You locked him in that room. You wanted him silent. We stood in stunned silence. So he died in this room? Clara whispered. Thaddeus? Holmes looked up. If this letter is to be believed, yes. And not only that, Reginald may have killed him. Suddenly a low chime rang through the chamber. We spun around. The bell on the plinth had moved just slightly, but enough to give a tremor. Holmes was across the room in a flash. Examining the base, there's a mechanism beneath, he said. Activated by pressure, perhaps heat. Someone above us has triggered it. A second chime sounded, louder this time. Time to go, I said. Now. We retraced our steps swiftly, the bell ringing once more as we exited the chamber. By the time we reached the top of the stairs, we could hear footsteps, soft, hurried, and retreating. Holmes threw open the hidden door, and we emerged once more into the chapel. It was empty, but the candle on the altar now burned with a fresh wick, and the black bell had been turned its clapper facing outward. They wanted us to know we're being watched, Holmes said. Or perhaps warned. Clara sat down heavily in one of the pews. What does it mean? The ritual, the bells, Thaddeus? It means, Holmes replied, that someone is repeating the past, or worse, completing it. He turned to me. Watson, I believe we are no longer investigating a murder. We are trying to prevent 1.Section 7, the keeper of the bell. The house had changed as we emerged from the chapel into the hallway beyond. I felt it distinctly, not a shift in the physical architecture of Blackthorn Hall, but in its atmosphere. The walls seemed to close in tighter. The shadows stretched longer. Even the silence had taken on a new tone, not the stillness of neglect, but the tension of anticipation, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Clara said nothing, her eyes wide and glassy, as Holmes helped her to her feet. I had never seen her look so shaken. She had endured much in recent days, her brother's disappearance, the summons to this haunted estate, and now the revelation of a hidden chamber built for rituals and blood. But this was different. This time something had pierced the veil, a family memory and superstition. She had looked into the truth, and the truth had looked back. Holmes led us briskly back toward the east wing, where the fire in our rooms still burned. Once inside, he locked the door and drew the heavy curtains closed. We are no longer guests, he said. We are participants, and the stage is being set for an act not yet written. I set down my satchel. You believe Reginald intends harm? Holmes turned from the window. I believe Reginald has not summoned us here to solve a mystery, but to bear witness to its final chapter. And if I'm correct, we have precious little time. He crossed to the desk and retrieved the documents we had taken from the threshold room. The confession of Edward Marshall C. now lay open on the writing blotter, its ink faded but legible. Holmes read again the final paragraph aloud. He would not stop reading it. Said he'd found a new way to be remembered. The fire took him, but something of him remains. He tapped the page. That line. Something of him remains. It implies more than memory or guilt. There is a suggestion here of persistence, perhaps even survival. You mean his spirit? Clara asked, hesitant. Holmes shook his head. No, not in the supernatural sense, but in legacy, in ritual, in the idea that what was done once may be done again deliberately, methodically, and with a purpose. He turned to her. Miss Ventnor, you mentioned your brother Edward heard the bell ring at your uncle's death. Did he tell you anything else about that night? Clara frowned. Only that it rang once. At midnight, he said he felt cold. Not physically, but something deeper. He never wanted to return after that. Yet he did, Holmes mused, and now he is missing. He stood abruptly. I must speak to Reginald, tonight and alone. Alone? I echoed. Holmes nodded. He will not speak freely in front of others. He believes himself the keeper of this ritual, whatever its true nature, and such men thrive in secrecy. But if I can unravel his motivation, we may yet prevent the bell from ringing again. Clara stepped forward. Let me come with you. He might listen to me. No, Holmes said firmly. He expects you to be afraid. Your fear is part of his plan. If you confront him, he will retreat further behind his veil of riddles. But if I go to him as a fellow man of logic one, who recognizes the value of tradition, he may show his hand. He paused. I need both of you to stay here and remain alert. Watson, if I do not return within the hour, follow the west hallway. There is a door marked with a serpent above the lintel. That will be where he waits. And with that, Holmes was gone. The silence that followed his departure was oppressive. I stoked the fire to life again, more for the comfort of movement than for heat. Clara paced restlessly near the window. Do you think he's in danger? She asked quietly. With Holmes, I said. Danger is never far behind, but he knows what he's doing. An hour passed. Then another dot. By the time the mantel clock struck 2, I could wait no longer. I loaded my revolver and drew on my coat, and nodded to Clara. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. She gripped my arm. Be careful. I moved through the corridor with slow, measured steps, the echo of my boots muffled by old carpeting and centuries of dust. The west wing had been long disused. Cobwebs hung in veils between the sconces, and many of the gas lamps were broken. I passed doors that had not been opened in decades, their brass knobs green with corrosion. At last, I found it. The door with the serpent carved into the lintel. A single candle burned in a bracket to the left, casting a snaking shadow across the threshold. I knocked once, got no answer. I turned the handle slowly and stepped inside. The room beyond was an old study, its wood-paneled walls lined with law books and ancient ledgers. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the figure seated beside it. Reginald Marshalsea. He looked up, his face gaunt and weary, though his eyes remained alert. Dr. Watson," he said calmly. I had expected Holmes. I stepped forward cautiously. "He came to speak with you, did he not?" Reginald smiled faintly. "Oh, we spoke, though I cannot say he understood." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Reginald said, "as much as he would hear." He stood slowly and moved to the mantel, where a small glass dome sat atop a pedestal. Beneath it was a bell miniature, black, identical in shape to the one in the chapel. "This house," he said, "was never merely a home. It is a reliquary, a place of memory, of penance. When the sins of the Marshallseas grew too heavy, we built rituals to contain them." He looked at me. "But some sins are not meant to be contained." He lifted the dome and struck the bell once with a small hammer. The note it emitted was pure and strangely soft, yet it vibrated through the room like a shiver through the bones. "It's begun," he said. I stepped forward. "Where is Holmes?" Reginald turned away. "He is with the heir." "What heir?" "The one who was promised, the one the bell called." Before I could respond, a noise behind me, soft, like the click of a door, made me spin around. Holmes stood in the doorway. "Watson," he said coolly, "step back." His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp. In his hand he held a folded document, the same confession we had retrieved from the crypt. "He means to complete the rite." Holmes sighed. "But not with sacrifice, with revelation." Reginald turned, his smile gone. "You misunderstand me, Holmes." "I think not," Holmes said. "You summoned us here to witness not merely your passing, but the unburdening of a century's worth of guilt." Holmes held up the letter. "I must ask," I said, turning to Derwent, "where have you been all these years?" "Europe, Asia. I studied with the custodians of forgotten texts, with archivists of shadowed libraries. I sought the truth of the eye, not its myth, but its method. What I discovered made me fear its return. And yet here you are," Holmes said. "I came because Arthur summoned me," Derwent replied. 3 weeks ago. His letter said he found something beneath the house and ossuary chamber. He feared what it might awaken. Holmes frowned. "Awaken?" A turn of phrase, perhaps, or perhaps not. The circle's final rite involves the awakening of the witness, a role meant to safeguard the line. Arthur believed the last true witness died with Julian Greystone in 1812. But he claimed to have found the mark again, on someone here. At that, Lady Edith looked sharply toward the stairs. "Elena," she whispered. Derwent's silence confirmed her suspicion. "Do you think she's the witness?" I asked. "I think she thinks she is," Derwent said. "Or worse, she believes she should be." Before Holmes could respond, a sudden sound echoed above us, a crash, sharp and jarring. Holmes and I were already on our feet. "The study," he said. "Come, Watson." We climbed the stairs 2 at a time, lantern in hand. The eastern wing felt colder than before, the corridors unnaturally silent. When we reached Sir Arthur's study, the door stood ajar. Holmes pushed it open with care. Room was a mess. The window had been forced open, its latch broken. Papers were scattered, drawers pulled out. Holmes rushed to the desk and reached behind the third drawer. "Damn it," he hissed. "The charter's gone." "The one you showed me?" I asked. He nodded. "Whoever was listening last night," they returned. And they knew exactly what they were looking for. Holmes knelt by the floor. Footprints, he murmured. Small, female, perhaps. They matched the pattern by the tunnel entrance. Clara? I asked. Or Elena, he said darkly. Back downstairs, Derwent stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. Holmes relayed the theft, and Derwent's expression hardened. With the charter, they can attempt the rite, he said. What does the rite entail? I asked. Derwent hesitated. It is symbolic, a ritual of recognition. The candidate must navigate the ossuary's path, place their blood upon the eye, and speak the oath. If successful, they're declared witness of the eye. In legend, the rite granted prophetic insight, but in truth it cements loyalty and control over the circle's resources. Holmes turned to the rest of us. Then, tonight, we go into the tunnels. All of us, even me? Asked Lady Greystone, pale but resolute. You know this house better than anyone, Holmes said. And if the final ceremony is to be completed, we must find the sanctuary before they do. Derwent nodded. The chapel tunnel leads there. Arthur found the beginning. I know the path. We prepared as dusk deepened into night. Holmes packed lanterns, chalk, and a small revolver. I carried the journal of Elijah Greystone for reference. Derwent studied the symbols etched onto the medallion, muttering under his breath in a language I could not recognize. Before we departed, Holmes paused at the door and turned back. There's still a piece missing, he said. Someone within. This house, not Elena, has guided this from the shadows. Someone who remains unseen. You think it's Clara? I asked. I think Clara is afraid, Holmes replied. And I think the true witness may not even know who they are. Outside, the wind had died completely, and the fog lay still as wool. Greystone Manor loomed behind us, its windows flickering like dying eyes. We descended into the tunnel, beneath the wine cellar once more, this time, together and ahead of us, somewhere in the cold dark, waited the sanctuary and the truth section. 9, the sanctuary beneath. The descent into the tunnels beneath Greystone Manor was unlike our previous forays. This time it was not simply Holmes and me, lantern in hand, chasing shadows and fragments. We were 4, Holmes, myself, Lady Edith Greystone, and Julian Derwent, and each step into the subterranean dark felt weighted with the gravity of legacy, an unseen danger. The air grew colder as we passed the threshold beneath the wine cellar. The stone stairs, hewn unevenly by generations past, echoed faintly underfoot. Our lanterns cast long, warped shadows against the moss-veined walls, and the silence aside from the distant dripping of water was absolute. Lady Edith wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I never imagined I would be down here. Again, she murmured. My father once warned us never to enter these passages. He said they had a will of their own. Holmes, at the front, stopped abruptly and turned to face her. What exactly did he mean? She hesitated. Only that. The tunnels were more than just architecture. He said they were built to obscure and protect, that some corridors were only meant to open for those who belonged to the bloodline. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Curious. That sort of statement would be dismissed as superstition, were it not for the uncanny precision with which the manor has guarded its secrets. Derwent stepped past us with his lantern raised. This way, he said. The eastern branch splits into 3 forks. The central one leads to the sanctum. We continued in silence. The stone gave way to older construction. Bricked archways carved with symbols, some faded, others alarmingly fresh. Holmes paused at one arch, tracing a gloved finger over a glyph, resembling the serpent devouring its tail, the same design on the Ophidian lens. "These markings were refreshed recently," he muttered. "Within the last month. Arthur must have been preparing the way." As we advanced, the corridor narrowed and the ceiling dropped low. Our footsteps grew softer, swallowed by the velvet hush of ages. The air was pungent with mildew and old earth, tinged with the faint scent of tallow candles. Then the corridor opened suddenly into a domed chamber, its ceiling a perfect half-sphere, supported by carved pillars. We had arrived. The sanctuary, it was breathtaking in its solemnity. At the center stood a circular altar made of black stone, veined with silver. Embedded in its surface was a shallow basin, now dry, though faint streaks of red along its edges suggested recent use. Around it, the walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a pedestal holding an item: an hourglass, a vial, a ring, a rolled scroll sealed in wax, and other curious relics. Holmes circled the altar carefully, his lantern casting light over the glyphs etched into the floor. "These markings are directional," he murmured, "a ritual path. The participant must follow a sequence before completing the rite." Lady Edith stepped beside him, her expression grim. "This chamber predates the manor. I believe it belonged to Elijah Greystone himself. My grandmother once mentioned the birthroom of knowledge. I thought it a metaphor." Derwent approached the altar reverently and removed the Ophidian lens from his pocket. He knelt and inserted it into a recess in the basin. It fit perfectly. With a low click, something within the altar shifted. A humming began, deep and resonant, like the purring of ancient machinery. Then the walls moved. No dash. Revealed. Panels on either side of the chamber slid open with a slow grind, revealing niches, hidden until now. One held a tall mirror framed in obsidian, its surface clouded yet pulsing faintly with inner light. The other held a single stone tablet, etched with characters not quite Latin, not quite Greek. Holmes turned slowly. "This is no ordinary sanctum. This was meant to guard knowledge, perhaps even to transform those who passed through its rites." He stepped closer to the mirror, eyes narrowing. "There's something beneath the surface." He reached into his coat and drew a pouch of chalk dust. Gently, he tossed a pinch over the mirror. For a moment, nothing. Then shapes formed a room. Stone walls, a figure hooded in black. The reflection showed not our chamber, but another space. Somewhere else in the tunnels. And someone was there. Watching. Holmes turned instantly. "That is no trick of glass. That is a live reflection. We are not alone." Just then a distant sound echoed from the corridor. Footsteps. Fast, light, rowing nearer. "Someone's coming," I whispered. Holmes motioned for the lights to be lowered. Derwent extinguished his lantern. We crouched in silence, breaths shallow, ears straining. The footsteps stopped outside the sanctuary. Then a soft voice called out, "Julian?" It was Elena. Derwent rose cautiously and moved toward the entrance. "Elena?" he said. "How did you—" "I followed you," she said, stepping into the light. Her eyes glimmered with something not quite surprise, not quite triumph. You should have known I would." Her gaze swept the chamber, pausing on the altar, the mirror, the open walls. "So it's real," she whispered. "The sanctuary." She stepped closer. "I knew it existed. I've read Arthur's journals. He was too cautious, too burdened by guilt. But I knew the right would lead here. And now it's mine." Derwent's voice was tight. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know enough," she replied. Arthur believed the Ophidian lens could awaken the eye and choose the next witness. I'm the only one who could complete the path. Holmes, who had remained perfectly still, now spoke. "You believe you're the rightful successor?" "I am," she said, her voice unwavering. "I bear the mark. On my shoulder, just like the texts described. Arthur saw it. That's why." He started writing again to Julian. He doubted me. But I studied. I proved my worth. This house is mine. The legacy is mine. Holmes stepped away from the mirror. "Then prove it." "What?" "You said the right would recognize its heir, complete the path, take the oath. If the eye accepts you, then we'll leave this chamber, and the matter will be settled." Derwent stared at Holmes. "You're serious?" "You were the one who locked the door, not Edward. You killed Thaddeus, and every bell that's rung since has been your penance." Reginald's hand trembled. "Then let the final bell ring," he whispered. He reached toward the small bell. Again, but Holmes crossed the room and placed his hand firmly over it. "No," Holmes said. "Not tonight." And in the silence that followed, the bell remained still. Section 8, echoes in the west wing. The small black bell on the mantelpiece stood untouched. A thin veil of silence followed Holmes's final words. For a long moment, nothing moved, not the fire, not the shadows dancing along the oak-paneled walls, not even the solemn breath of Reginald Marshalsea, who seemed trapped between pride and collapse. Then, at last, he sank into the wing-back chair, his hand falling limply to his side. "I never wished to become a warden," he said, voice hollow. "I only ever meant to protect what little remained." Holmes stood rigid beside him, the folded confession in one hand, the other still resting firmly on the bell, as though even the faintest sound might undo whatever fragile thread held the moment together. "You became a warden of ghosts, Mr. Marshalsea," Holmes said, his voice low, "of memories half buried and rituals half remembered. But this house, this family, has grown too accustomed to shadows. Now the light must come in." I stepped further into the room. The atmosphere had shifted. Reginald's expression no longer held the rigid control he had worn since our arrival. His posture had slackened. His gaze, once calculating, was now distant, focused somewhere far beyond the flame-lit walls. "I tried," he murmured, after Edward vanished. "I thought if I performed the rite again, as the old journals instructed, he would return. But the bell rang only once, and I was the only one to hear it." He looked up at Holmes. "It was never supposed to be this way. We were children. We were cruel. We didn't understand." Holmes studied him for a long moment before replying. "And yet you understood enough to keep the secret buried." Reginald did not answer. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, gather Miss Ventnor and meet me in the threshold room in 15 minutes. We are going to bring this farce to its end." I nodded and exited the study quickly, my footsteps echoing through the corridor with renewed urgency. The house felt heavier now, though. Perhaps that was only the weight of truth beginning to settle in. When I returned to our quarters, I found Clara standing by the window, the drapes parted just enough to reveal the storm-lashed lawn beyond. She turned sharply as I entered. "Well?" she asked. "Did you find Holmes?" "I did," I replied, retrieving my coat and hat. "And we've learned more in the last hour than in all the days prior. But now he asks us to join him. In the chapel? In the threshold room beneath it. He believes the time for answers has arrived." Clara paled. "And Reginald?" I hesitated. "He won't stop us." We returned swiftly through the manor's labyrinthine halls. Rain pattered against the stained glass windows, throwing fractured colors across the floors. The shadows of saints and martyrs stretched long behind us as we passed beneath them at the statue of St. Matthias. Holmes' weighted lantern already, lit, eyes gleaming with a quiet determination. "Good," he said as we approached. "You've come prepared." Without ceremony he pressed the hidden panel again, and the stone slid aside. We descended together into the darkness, the cold air rising to meet us like the breath of some forgotten tomb. But this time the chamber below felt different. Where once the brazier had burned low, now several torches along the walls had been lit. The flame flickered across the runes and carvings, bathing the threshold room in amber light. On the central plinth the iron bell still rested, but now a sheet of aged parchment had been laid before it handwritten. The ink still drying. Holmes approached and lifted it gently. "It's in Reginald's hand," he said. "A second confession. He." "Read it aloud, slowly," his voice echoing through the stone chamber. "To whoever finds this, I leave my truth. Thaddeus Marshalsea died not by fire, but by betrayal. We mocked the rites, yes, but it was I who turned the key, I who let the flames grow unchecked. And though the house rebuilt itself above his bones, I never did. I have lived as warden and coward alike. Let the bell toll once more, if it must, but let it toll for me." Clara stepped back, her hand trembling. "Does this mean he's going to?" "No," Holmes interrupted. "Not if I can stop it." He turned to me. "Watson, in the far corner behind the low altar, you'll find a mechanism in the floor. Lift it." I obeyed. There, just as he had said, was a small iron lever built flush into the stone. I pulled it carefully. A deep groan of shifting masonry followed, and a narrow panel opened behind the wall bearing the eye symbols. A hidden passage. Holmes entered first, lantern held high. The corridor stretched no more than 20 feet before ending at a small door plane. Wood, unmarked. Behind it we found a chamber, and like the others, it was a child's room. Faded toys sat on a low shelf. A wooden horse leaned precariously in the corner. A small bed, its frame warped by time and damp, rested beneath a slanted ceiling. And on the bed, covered by a gray woolen blanket, was the still figure of Reginald Marshalsea. Holmes crossed, too. Him swiftly pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "He's alive," he said. "Barely. There's a bottle on the floor, laudanum. He must have drunk it minutes ago." I rushed to his side, examining the bottle and its contents. Not enough to kill outright, but enough to slow the breath. "We must get him upstairs," Holmes said. "He's chosen the right of silence, but I won't let him seal this house with it." Clara turned away, her shoulders shaking. "He always wanted to end it," she whispered. "He just didn't know how." Holmes laid the parchment on the child's desk and placed the small black bell beside it. "This room," he said, "was Thaddeus's, and now it is Reginald's confessional." Together we carried him out of the hidden room and up the narrow steps. The night still howled outside. But inside, for the first time in years, the threshold room stood quiet, and the bell remained still. Section 9. The Disappearance of Edward Ventnor. The sky beyond Blackthorn Hall was beginning to soften into dawn's earliest light by the time Holmes and I carried Reginald Marshalsea up the winding staircase. His body, slack and trembling, hung between us like the weight of the secrets he had borne for decades. Miss Clara Ventnor walked behind us, one hand to her mouth, her expression unreadable. Inside the drawing room, the fire had dwindled into amber coals. I helped Holmes lay Reginald onto the velvet settee while Clara fetched a blanket. The rich scent of oak smoke mingled with the musty age of the furnishings, wrapping the chamber in a melancholy fog. Holmes removed his gloves and coat and turned silently toward the fire, his lean frame drawn tall and still in the glow. I checked Reginald's pulse, slow but steady now. The laudanum had done its work, but not fatally. He would wake in several hours, provided no further harm came to him. Holmes had not spoken since we had left the threshold room. His eyes remained fixed on the flames, as if seeing beyond them into some invisible constellation of motives and clues. When he finally turned to us, there was steel in his voice. "Miss Ventnor," he said quietly, "there can be no more half-truths. I need every detail your brother shared with you in the days before he disappeared." Clara, sitting on the armrest beside her uncle, looked up. Her face was pale, but her eyes held resolve. "I've told you what I know. He came here of his own accord. He said he had something to investigate." Holmes frowned faintly. "You mentioned once that Edward had dreams, nightmares to be precise." Her brow furrowed. "Yes, for weeks before he arrived. The bell, he said he heard it in his sleep. It terrified him." "Did he describe these dreams in detail?" "I think so. He kept a journal." Holmes turned sharply. "You know where it is?" "In his study, back in Kensington." He didn't hesitate. "Then that is where we must go immediately." I looked at him, surprised. "You mean to return to London?" "The answers we need are not here, not yet. Edward's journal may contain the key to understanding why he was summoned here, and by whom." Clara looked hesitant. "Then I'll come too." "No," Holmes said, more firmly than before. "You must stay. Your uncle needs supervision, and should anything occur in our absence—" He withdrew a folded slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "This is the address of my rooms on Baker Street. If I am not there, leave a message with Mrs. Hudson. Should Reginald regain consciousness, try to persuade him to speak plainly. He is still hiding something." Her expression darkened. "He's hidden many things, for too long." Minutes later, Holmes and I were in the cab again, rattling eastward toward the rising sun, leaving behind the haunted grandeur of Blackthorn Hall. As we drove, Holmes sat deep in thought, tapping a gloved finger against his lips. "You think Edward's dreams are connected to the bell itself?" I asked. "I think they are connected to someone who wanted him to come to that bell," Holmes replied, "and that someone used the only language Edward couldn't ignore, his own mind." The Ventnor house in Kensington was a modest but elegant three-story residence, faced in pale brick and lined with ivy. The housekeeper, having been alerted of our arrival by telegraph, greeted us at the door with bleary eyes and ushered us toward Edward's study on the second floor. The room was small but impeccable. Rich walnut shelves framed a tall window overlooking a quiet garden. A Persian rug lay beneath a mahogany desk, whose surface bore only a green-shaded lamp, a brass letter opener, and a stack of journals bound with string. Holmes moved quickly to the drawer on the right-hand side of the desk and removed a narrow black volume. It was bound in soft leather, its spine creased and smudged from use. "This is his most recent," Holmes murmured, flicking through the opening pages. The entries began with routine musings, lectures he had attended at the Royal Society, brief mentions of Clara's charity engagements, an offhand complaint about the wine served at a museum gala. Then the tone shifted. October 3rd. Dreamt of the bell again. The black iron bell. It rang only once, but the echo went on for minutes. I felt summoned, not frightened. Not yet, but summoned. October 8th. The bell was silent last night. Instead, I saw the corridor, the threshold room, perhaps. Symbols etched into the floor. The Ouroboros again. Same as before. October 12th, a letter came by morning post. No return address. Just one phrase. The heir must return to the threshold. Wax seal black with an Ouroboros. My hand shook as I read it. October 13th. Clara denies knowing anything. About Uncle Thaddeus. I found a record of his burial in the family crypt, but no cause of death listed. Strange, very strange. October 17th, visited father's grave. Left with more questions. Why were the rites never discussed? Why are the Marshalseas so obsessed with silence? October 20th, the dream again. This time I walked through the west wing, except it was not the house as I know it. It was older, darker. At the end of the corridor was the bell. It rang before I touched it. And then I heard a child's laughter. October 21st, I must go. Something waits for me there. Not just answers, something older than memory. Holmes closed the journal and looked at me. His face was unreadable. Someone sent that letter, he said. They knew of the bell. They knew how to manipulate Edward's mind, and they wanted him at Blackthorn at a specific time. Midnight. Do you suspect Reginald? I asked. No. He may be the warden of the house, but he is not the architect of this plan. Someone else has been guarding the rites, guiding them. I frowned. But the Marshalseas are the only ones left. Holmes nodded slowly. Which means this may be a rite passed down, not just through blood, but through ideology. A cult of silence, Watson, built around an ancient symbol, a secret room, and a bell that was never meant to be rung. He crossed to the shelves, scanning the titles. We've been thinking too narrowly. This isn't just a case of one missing man. It's a case of a missing history. Then we returned to Blackthorn. Tonight, Holmes said. And this time we ring the bell ourselves. Section 10. Midnight returns to Blackthorn. The wind had turned cold by the time we arrived once more at Blackthorn Hall. Twilight stained the sky in hues of violet and indigo. The western horizon bleeding behind jagged trees and skeletal hedgerows. The manor loomed before us, gaunt, ivy-choked, and utterly still. Holmes stood motionless at the gates for a moment, as if letting the house size him up again. Then, with a determined flick of his coat, he moved forward. The house has secrets still to give, he said. Tonight, Watson, we will coax them out. Inside, Clara was waiting. She met us in the foyer, where a single oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked, tiled floor. "He hasn't woken," she whispered, glancing toward the drawing room. Holmes placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then he sleeps, under a silence of his own making. We must act without him." Clara hesitated. "Holmes, I've remembered something. When I was very small, I wandered into the east corridor one night. It was snowing outside. I remember the windows being covered in frost. I heard a voice, a man humming. I never saw his face, but the tune, it stayed with me. She hummed, a slow, mournful melody, half a lullaby, half a dirge." Holmes froze. "That tune," he said. "Watson, you remember the journal?" I nodded. Edward described hearing a lullaby while dreaming of the bell. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then the melody is the key passed from generation to generation, tied to the right? A trigger, perhaps?" He turned to Clara. "Miss Ventnor, stay close to your uncle. If he wakes, do not let him leave this house. And keep a candle burning at all times. Light may be your best defense tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, then saw something in Holmes's expression that made her swallow her words. He and I descended toward the lower level, the original foundations of Blackthorn, all armed with lanterns, a coil of rope, and the revolver I had insisted on retrieving from our luggage. The door to the threshold room stood open, revealing its terrible geometry once more. Holmes did not hesitate. He moved directly to the eastern wall, the one adorned with the Ouroboros relief, and began pressing its edges with his fingertips, searching for a hidden mechanism. I watched, my hand clutching the revolver more tightly than I cared to admit. Finally, Holmes stepped back. "It's not a panel," he said. "It's a resonance lock." "A what?" "The bell," Holmes said. "It doesn't just summon. It opens." I stared at him. "You mean?" "Yes, Watson. We must ring it." He crossed to the center of the chamber, to where the cracked iron bell hung crookily above the plinth. Reaching into his coat, he produced a small leather mallet, the kind used by clocksmiths. "You retrieved that from the carriage," I murmured. He allowed himself the faintest smile. "I always prepare for symphonies, Doctor, even the discordant." "Kind." He raised the mallet and brought it down. The sound that followed was not a chime, but a groan, a deep, almost subsonic hum that echoed not just in the stone chamber, but in our bones. The flame in our lanterns flickered violently. Somewhere behind the wall, we heard a heavy click, followed by the slow grind of moving stone. A section of the eastern wall slid inward, revealing a narrow spiral stair descending into darkness. Holmes lifted the lantern. "This," he said, "is where the ritual truly begins." We descended slowly, each footfall echoing. The air grew colder, damp with the smell of ancient earth and iron. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a chamber so old that time itself seemed to cling to its stones. It was circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with walls covered in carved symbols, some familiar, most incomprehensible. In the center stood a raised dais upon which rested a single stone cradle. Holmes moved forward, lantern raised. The cradle was empty, but around it were objects: a withered rattle, stained linen, and a child's blanket embroidered with the same Ouroboros design. Beside the cradle, etched into the stone floor, was a date, 1823, I read aloud, the year Edward Marshall C. died. Holmes knelt and examined the carvings around the cradle. These are not Christian symbols, he said. This rite predates Anglicanism, possibly even Druidic. But what does it mean? I asked. That the bell was not a call to the living, Holmes replied, but a call to the dead. Before I could respond, a second sound reached our ears. Footsteps. Not echoing from behind us, but from ahead. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging us into blackness. He motioned for silence and crouched low behind the dais. I joined. Him, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, steady, unhurried. A figure entered the chamber, holding a single taper candle. The light illuminated a familiar face, gaunt, eyes sunken, lips twisted in an eerie half-smile. Reginald Marshalsea. But something was wrong. His gaze was vacant, almost sleepwalking. He approached the cradle, knelt before it, and began to hum. Clara's melody. Holmes's hand gripped my arm. He's been conditioned, he whispered. The ritual was planted in him, repeated across decades. He is performing it now, unconsciously. Reginald's humming faded. He lifted the empty blanket and cradled it as if holding an invisible child. Then, with eyes wide, he began to speak. The bloodline has failed. The heir did not return. The bell rang without consent. The curse cannot be contained. His voice dropped to a rasp. Open the way. He turned toward the rear wall and raised his candle. A symbol ignited, painted in some invisible chemical, revealing a hidden doorway we hadn't seen. And then he collapsed. Holmes rushed forward, catching the man just as his body crumpled. I followed, checking for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. The trance broke, I said. The effort was too much. Holmes examined the illuminated symbol. He wasn't the orchestrator, he murmured. He was merely the vessel. I stood. Then who? Holmes rose. Beside me. We'll find out soon enough, he said, pushing open the hidden door. Section 11. The true heir of Blackthorn. The hidden corridor behind the threshold door sloped downward, carved from ancient stone and coated in centuries of damp. As Holmes led the way with his lantern held high, shadows twisted on the walls like memories trying to return. Each step we took echoed faintly behind us, as though the house itself were listening. Holmes paused to study the markings that lined the walls. Not merely decorative, he murmured, tracing the faint outlines of Celtic knots and Romanesque symbols. These were carved with intent, a rite of passage, a corridor of awakening. Awakening what? I asked, lowering my voice instinctively. He didn't answer. At the base of the corridor we came upon a massive door of darkened oak, reinforced with oxidized iron bands. Strange, nearly illegible Latin had been carved across the lintel, reading, Veritas in silentio. Truth in silence, Holmes translated, a fitting creed for this family of secrets. The handle was forged in the shape of a coiled serpent, devouring its own tail. Yet another Ouroboros. Holmes gave the handle a firm twist. The hinges protested with a groan that sounded almost like a warning. The door opened into a vast subterranean chamber. The contrast from the corridor was stark. Where the hall had been cold and narrow, the chamber breathed an oppressive warmth, like a sealed tomb filled with the breath of forgotten generations. Rows upon rows of towering bookcases stretched into the gloom, lit only by a few flickering lanterns and a candle sputtering on a distant desk. Took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dimness, and then I saw her dot at the far end of the room. Seated in a high-backed chair beneath a tapestry of ancient heraldry was a woman so still she might have been carved from marble. Her white hair was braided into a long rope that fell over one shoulder. Her dress, jet black, shimmered faintly with intricate silver embroidery, and Erebaris circled at her throat like a living necklace. She turned slowly toward us. Her eyes were sharp and black as flint. "You're later than I expected," she said. Holmes strode forward without hesitation, though his hand never left the inside of his coat, where his pistol rested. "And you are earlier than I hoped. It seems we are both disappointed." A faint smile tugged at the corners of her thin mouth. "I imagined the famous Mr. Holmes would be taller, and I imagined the last living remnant of a cursed bloodline would be more cautious." Touché. Holmes came to a stop just short of her desk. "Who are you?" "A record keeper. A custodian of what others have tried to forget." "You sent the letter to Edward Ventnor." "I did. Though, as I now see, that action has invited far more scrutiny than I intended. But the right must continue." Holmes raised a brow. "What right?" "The right of midwinter, the calling, the tolling of the air. Call it what you will. Each generation has its own name for the same nightmare. And you believed Edward was the rightful heir?" "I did, until he refused the call. That night, when the bell rang without his consent, something else was set in motion. Something I fear cannot be reversed." I could no longer contain myself. "Madam, forgive my intrusion, but you're speaking in riddles. What is this curse? This bell? What, exactly, are you trying to prevent?" Her eyes fell on me like the slow closing of a vault door. "You must understand that the Marshalsea line is not merely aristocratic, it is ancestral. The name Blackthorne was not chosen. It was inherited from something older than this country." Holmes gestured to the many shelves filled with decaying tomes. "This is not merely a library. It's a vault of memory." "Precisely. Every dream, every vision, every affliction suffered by a Marshalsea heir is recorded here. And among them, she gestured toward a shelf behind her, are the journals of Reginald Marshalsea." Holmes approached and removed a thin, cracked volume bound in black leather. He opened it, and we both leaned in to read. The entries began plainly enough accounts of headaches, fragmented dreams, a sense of being watched while asleep, but they quickly descended into obsession. Sketches of the bell, diagrams of rituals, lists of dates when the bell had tolled in error. One page caught Holmes's attention. A sketch of a child wrapped in a swaddling cloth embroidered with the Ouroboros. "This symbol again," I muttered. "What does it mean?" The woman answered. "The cycle. Rebirth through sacrifice. The Marshalseas believed that the bell tethered them to a balance and ancient contract that, if broken, would unleash madness into their line, and from their line into the world." Holmes closed the journal. Reginald believed he could fulfill the rite. He tried. He failed. The bell would not accept his offering. He did not carry the pure bloodline. And Edward? Too fractured, too fearful. He broke the chain. Then, Holmes said carefully, "Who remains?" The woman stood slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for her frail appearance. She turned and removed a slender wooden box from beneath the desk. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, was a birth certificate. Clara. Ventnor. The room fell into complete silence. Holmes whispered, "Edward's daughter." "Yes," she said, "born of an affair hidden from the family. Her existence scrubbed from records to preserve Edward's standing. But she is the true heir." I was staggered. Clara doesn't know. She does not, but she must. And she must toll the bell at midnight, or what sleeps beneath Blackthorn will rise. Holmes stared at the woman. "You speak of something ancient, something buried. Is this metaphor or madness?" She did not blink. "Does it matter? If generations have suffered the same affliction, obeyed the same rite, and feared the same toll, then it matters not whether it is metaphorical. The consequences are real. Madness, death, and now collapse." Holmes turned to me, his face pale but resolute. "Watson, we must find Clara." The woman placed a hand on Holmes's arm. "One warning," she said. "If she refuses the bell, it will toll regardless. But its toll will be answered not by the blood of Blackthorn, but by something that has long waited in its shadow." He met her eyes. "Then we'd best ensure she rings it willingly." Section 12, the toll of TRUT, the underground chamber, receded behind us as we retraced our steps through the narrow, winding corridor that led to the surface of Blackthorn Hall. Though the air was colder now, thick with the scent of mildew and ash, I could feel the heat of Holmes's urgency pulsing forward in every stride he took. We emerged from the hidden passage, back into the quiet of the ruined chapel. The pews, long rotted into skeletons of wood, now seemed more like mourners than furniture bound toward a pulpit that no longer spoke. Moonlight filtered in through broken stained glass, casting fractured halos on the floor like relics of lost faith. Clara Ventnor stood by the threshold, her brow furrowed as she pressed a damp cloth to Reginald's forehead. The man still unconscious. From the confrontation, murmured in his stupor words in no tongue, I recognized. "Clara," Holmes said, stepping toward her. She looked up, startled by his tone. "Is he dying?" "No," Holmes replied gently, "though I suspect something. Inside him already has." She met his gaze. "What do you mean?" Holmes crouched beside her, his hand brushing aside Reginald's sleeve, to reveal a strange mark etched into the skin beneath, almost like a burn, but in the form of the Ouroboros. "It's a scar of the right," Holmes said. "A scar born, not from flame, but from failure. He attempted something he should not have, something not meant for him." "I don't understand," she said, voice trembling. "What does this have to do with me?" Holmes took her gently by the arm and helped her to her feet. He led her to one of the remaining pews and sat beside her. "Clara," he said, voice softer than I had ever heard from him, "we now know you are not Reginald's niece. You are Edward Ventnor's daughter." She blinked, lips parting, but no sound came. Holmes pressed the birth certificate into her hands. "He tried to shield you from the burden," Holmes continued. "He never told anyone, not even you. But in hiding the truth, he may have doomed this place." Tears welled in her eyes as she read. "He told me I was a foundling, that my mother died in childbirth. I always believed he had saved me from poverty, that he raised me out of kindness." Holmes hesitated, then said with measured weight, "He loved you. That part was never false. But he also knew the family line must endure. The right demands a toll from those of the true bloodline. Clara's face drained of color. What toll? The bell, I said quietly. It must be rung tonight at midnight. The solstice is near. If it is not rung by you, something else may rise to claim the right. Something your ancestors spent centuries keeping at bay. Her hands clenched the parchment so tightly I feared it would tear. What happens if I refuse? Holmes stood. Then the echoes in this house become more than sounds. They become voices, actions, deaths. You saw it in Edward's final days. His mind frayed not by madness, but by memory old and shared. Those dreams will become yours, and then worse. She swallowed hard, then nodded. Take me there. We helped her down the corridor once more, this time heading not toward the underground library, but back toward the bell tower itself. The climb was a slow one. Spiral stone steps curved upward in dizzying arcs, each step narrower than the last. The air grew colder with altitude, and the walls of the tower seemed to sweat frost despite the season. Wind howled through the gaps in the stones like a beast longing to be let in dot as we ascended. Clara began to hum softly something tuneless, like a child trying to soothe herself. Holmes turned back to her. Are you all right? She paused and touched her chest. I feel light, as if I've been walking toward this moment my whole life and never realized it. We reached the top landing at last. The belfry lay before us circular, open to the air in 4 directions, where louvered shutters creaked in the wind. At the center hung the great bell of BLACKTHORNE. It was an immense thing cast in black iron, mottled with greenish patina, and so old that no maker's mark remained. A single word was inscribed around its base in raised lettering. Requiro. I require, Holmes murmured, translating. The bell's rope, twisted and frayed, hung low like the tail of some sleeping beast. Clara approached it slowly, her fingertips trailing along the edge of the bell's mouth. Her eyes fluttered closed, and I could see her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps simply memory. Is it dangerous? She asked. It is necessary, Holmes replied, and if I ring it, then the lineage continues. The right is honored. The house sleeps another generation. She looked at him. And if I don't? He didn't answer. She stepped to the rope. Her hands hovered there for a moment. Then she turned back to us. Will you both stay? Of course, I said, and Holmes gave a single solemn nod. She took the rope. The first pull was gentle, just enough to make the bell shiver. Then she pulled harder. A single toll rang out. It rolled across the night like a storm breaking, low and thunderous. The sound vibrated through my chest and settled deep into my bones. A second toll followed, and then a third. The air thickened. I could feel pressure building, not just in the tower, but within myself. The very sky seemed to hold its breath. A fourth toll. This time a scream somewhere distant, from within the walls of Blackthorn Hall. Holmes, I whispered. Something's wrong. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Not wrong. Revealed. We rushed to the edge of the belfry, where the shutters offered a view of the grounds below. A glow was emerging from beneath the earth, a pale circular light forming. A ring around the chapel ruins. Something was buried there. Holmes muttered. Something old. Suddenly Clara collapsed. We turned to her. She was still breathing, but her eyes fluttered, her limbs twitching as if caught in a dream. Holmes knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms. She completed the rite, he said, but the toll required more than she had. A faint whisper curled around us, no voice, no wind, just breath-made sound. "She sleeps," Holmes whispered. "As Edward did." I glanced at him. "Then we've failed?" "No," he said. "She bought us time. A generation, perhaps two. The bell sleeps. Once more. But its echo will return." I looked down at her peaceful face, and for the first time in all this madness, I saw not terror but silence. A silence earned. Section 13. The toll sealed LESTD by the time the chill morning light filtered into the drawing room of Blackthorn Hall. The previous night's events had settled into the heavy silence that only follows the truly unexplainable. Outside, the mist had thickened into a low-hanging fog, blurring the hedgerows and bare trees, until the landscape seemed like something glimpsed in a dream, or a memory. Holmes stood at the long, arched window, his gaze fixed not on the exterior, but on his own reflection. His brow was furrowed in thought, though his posture was deceptively calm. I had learned long ago that when Sherlock Holmes appeared most relaxed, his mind was often at its most feverish. I sat by the fire with a blanket around my shoulders and a teacup in hand, half watching the flames dance and half studying Clara. Ventnor, who lay still on the chaise longue, her complexion had recovered some color during the night, and the tension in her jaw had softened. Her eyes, closed but fluttering beneath their lids, hinted at vivid dreams still unfolding within. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you believe she's out of danger?" He didn't turn. "She is out of immediate danger, yes. But the right has left its mark upon her, Watson. It will echo inside her for the rest of her life." I looked at her again. She was so still, almost too still. "And the house?" Holmes turned. At that, one eyebrow raised. "The house will sleep as it has before. Blackthorn doesn't need to be destroyed, Watson. It needs to be remembered. Its silence isn't a curse. It's a vigil." He walked across the room and knelt beside Clara, placing 2 fingers gently on her wrist. A few moments passed. He nodded. "She'll wake soon. Her pulse is steady." At that moment, a knock echoed from the front hall. 3 quick raps, cautious and restrained. I stood still a bit stiff and opened the door. It was Lestrade. The inspector looked a touch less flustered than usual, though a deep fatigue lingered in the lines beneath his eyes. He removed his bowler hat and stepped inside, glancing around the dark interior of the manor as if expecting the walls to whisper secrets. "Morning, gentlemen," he said gruffly. "Is she—" Holmes gestured to Clara, resting. She completed the rite. The toll was accepted. Lestrade made a sound between a sigh and a grunt as he took a seat opposite the fireplace. "You'll forgive me if I don't pretend to understand everything that's happened here. I've been to dozens of estates where men killed for inheritance, but never one where a woman had to ring a bloody haunted bell to stop some ancestral curse." Holmes chuckled. "Nor have I, though I find this one refreshingly direct." Lestrade looked uneasy. "Did anyone else hear it? The bell?" I asked. He nodded. "At the stroke of midnight, in the village. Father Bray said he woke up thinking it was Judgment Day." Holmes's expression darkened. It was a warning and a reassurance. The land knows now that the lineage has not broken. Seems to me it's more than the land keeping watch, Lestrade muttered. What about the chapel? It will remain sealed, Holmes said. The passageway was barricaded at sunrise. The books remain hidden beneath the floor. Their knowledge, like the rite, is not meant for public discourse. Lestrade exhaled, massaging his temples. And the official story, Holmes rose. Edward Ventnor died of natural causes. Reginald Ventnor, after a bout of mental instability, has been committed to a sanatorium, an outcome not entirely untrue. The bell's toll was chalked up to a structural shift in the belfry caused by the recent frost. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but most people prefer that. Lestrade stood. I'll file the report accordingly, but I've half a mind to burn this entire place to the ground. Holmes gave him a faint smile. You wouldn't be the first to try, nor the last to regret it. Lestrade lingered a moment longer, as if contemplating whether to say more, then simply nodded and departed, his boots echoing through the stone corridor before fading into silence. I turned to Holmes. What of Clara? What will she do now? She will inherit the estate, Holmes replied, walking to the writing desk. She is the sole Ventnor heir. Blackthorn Hall, its lands, and its burdens now fall to her. Will she stay here? I believe she must. Someone must keep the bell. Its power is not in its peals, but in the memory it safeguards. Just then a quiet voice murmured behind us. She's right here. We turned. Clara was sitting up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Her expression was calm, serene, even, but her eyes had changed. There was something sharper in them, something older. Miss Ventnor, Holmes said, bowing slightly. You stayed, she said softly as she looked between us. As we promised, I replied. She swung her legs off the chaise and stood slowly, testing her balance. I moved to help her, but she waved me off. I feel clearer than I've ever felt before. That clarity may come and go, Holmes cautioned. What you experienced last night, what you remembered, those impressions may resurface in fragments. The mind can only house so much history before it cracks. Clara smiled. Then I'll build a stronger house. Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. There's something else, isn't there? She nodded. In the dream, or whatever it was, I saw a room beneath the tower, a second crypt, sealed in stone. It had carvings older than anything in the library. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What was inside? Clara hesitated. A cradle, empty, but still rocking. Neither Holmes nor I spoke for a long moment. The fire snapped behind us. Outside, the wind stirred. I believe, Holmes said finally, that is a mystery for the next heir. Clara turned to the window, watching the sun struggle through the mist. I don't think the bell rings for the dead, she said. I think it rings to keep the living from forgetting. And what will you do now? I asked. I'll stay, she said simply. The land remembers. The house does too. Someone must listen. Holmes gave a rare nod of approval. Then, Blackthorn has its keeper. He moved to retrieve his coat and hat. Come, Watson, our part in this tale has concluded. As we made our way to the front doors, Clara followed us, her feet bare on the marble floor. Holmes turned to her one. Last time. If ever you hear it ring again, and it is not by your hand, send for me. Clara smiled. I think the bell will sleep for now. With that, we stepped out into the morning fog. The path from Blackthorn Hall to the iron gate seemed longer than I remembered, and quieter. Not with dread, but with peace. As the carriage pulled away down the muddy lane, I looked back one final time. Clara stood at the door like a silhouette carved from light, one hand resting on the frame, the other clutching the small bell-pull cord inside. The house stood tall behind her, its stone dark and weathered, its tower now silent. But something had changed. Not the place. The keeper. And as Holmes and I rode into the gray distance, the mist curling behind us like pages of an unwritten tale, I could not help but feel that we had left more than a solved mystery behind us. We had left a legacy, tended to a secret passed on in a silence kept. Section 14. The Last P.E. Elliot. A week after we had returned to London, when I found Holmes once again seated in the great armchair by the fire at Baker Street, his long fingers steepled before his face and his eyes distant, as though staring through time itself. Outside, the wind whistled down the chimneys of our street, but within our sitting room the fire glowed with steady warmth. I had only just returned from the Queen's Head pub, where I'd been discussing with a fellow physician the peculiarities of trance-like states and post-hypnotic suggestion subjects that, in the wake of our recent case, had acquired a personal fascination. I poured myself a brandy and sat opposite Holmes, still thinking about Blackthorn. His hands parted, and he leaned forward, eyes sharp once more. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever encountered a structure that behaves like a living thing? A house, you mean haunted?" "No, not haunted. Responsive." He tapped the arm of his chair. Blackthorn Hall did not merely hold history, it reacted to it, adapted. That bell in the tower wasn't a remnant of the past. It was a signal, like a warning. Holmes shook his head. A threshold. Clara Ventnor did not silence the past. She acknowledged it. The rite she performed was not exorcism. It was inheritance. I sipped my brandy slowly, letting the thought settle. "And the mystery? Have you truly unraveled it all?" "I believe I have." He stood and moved to the mantel, where a small sheaf of notes was tucked, beneath a carved ivory paperweight in the shape of a serpent eating its tail. "I have examined all my observations from the moment we first arrived. At Blackthorn Hall, the accounts of the villagers, the cryptic inheritance papers, the diagrams of the passageway beneath the chapel, even Clara's descriptions of her dreams. It all points to a singular conclusion. The bell is a mechanism of memory, not judgment, but there was more to it." He turned, eyes glittering. "You remember the phrase inscribed beneath the bell frame?" I recalled it vividly. "Quod sonat, non est mortem. That which tolls is not death." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Most would interpret it as poetic reassurance, but taken literally and in conjunction with the old church records from the 17th century, which I reviewed in London, it reveals the bell's true origin. It wasn't a funerary bell at all. It was a signal used by recusant Catholics during the reign of Elizabeth I. I sat straighter. Secret worshippers? Exactly. The bell was rung to summon the faithful to clandestine masses. The chapel beneath the manor predates the estate's modern foundation by at least 2 centuries. What we thought of as pagan or occult was in fact an elaborate veil of religious defiance. But what about the symbols, the ritual markings? Layered. Over time, Holmes explained, Each generation added its own beliefs and fears to the structure. The vintners didn't understand what they inherited, but they recognized its power. When Clara rang the bell, she wasn't performing a ritual of submission. She was invoking a rite of continuity. I leaned forward. And Edward Ventnor? Reginald? Edward sought to suppress it. His fear led him to manipulate Clara, to prevent the tolling. He believed the bell would awaken something dreadful. In truth, it was his own denial that brought about his end. Reginald, for his part, misinterpreted the ancestral memories as madness. He saw the darkness without understanding. The light. Holmes's gaze turned contemplative. In the end, it was Clara who understood the simplest truth, that one must acknowledge what one inherits, not flee from it. We sat in silence for a while. I turned to the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones, grateful to be far from Blackthorn's damp stone and buried vaults. But still, some part of me remained there, walking the shadowed halls, hearing the faint echo of that midnight toll. Eventually, Holmes spoke again, in that rare, quiet tone he reserved for truths. Too delicate to announce with certainty, there are places, Watson, where time pools instead of flowing, where memory sinks into the earth and waits. Blackthorn Hall was one such place. It does not forget. And Clara? He offered the smallest of smiles. She remembers enough for them all. A few days later, a letter arrived by post. Holmes handed it to me wordlessly, his eyes already dancing with curiosity. Dared it bore the wax seal of Blackthorn Hall. I opened it to find Clara's handwriting, careful and elegant, though it had taken on a new firmness since we last saw her dot. My dear Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, I hope this letter finds you both well and far from cold, echoing corridors. The house has been quiet since your departure, but not silent. I have found journals I never knew existed written by women in my bloodline, long hidden beneath the altar in the chapel. Each speaks of their tolling of the bell, their dreams, and the responsibilities they carried. I understand now what I must do, not merely to preserve the estate, but to preserve its truth. The bell is not a curse, it is a keeper of oaths. I will ensure it has never rung in fear again. Dot, thank you for seeing me, for trusting me, and for staying until the end. Clara Ventnor P.S. The cradle beneath the tower has stopped rocking. Holmes folded the letter and tucked it into the fireplace, letting it curl to ash without a word. As the flames consumed it, he turned to me. Come, Watson. There's a telegram from Brussels. A banker's wife has vanished from a locked room. Shall we investigate? I smiled, reaching for my coat. After Blackthorn, I'll welcome a case with less spectral tolling. He was already at the door, and as we stepped once more into the fog-lined streets of London, I felt the final peal of the bell drift away behind us. Not a sound, but a silence. Earned, not death, memory, the end. As we descended, the heavy front doors opened with a low groan, revealing a man who looked as though he had stepped directly from the last century. He was tall and skeletal, his face pale and deeply lined, and his clothing immaculately preserved, though of an unmistakably outdated style. You are expected, he intoned without so much as an introduction. Holmes tipped his hat. Ramsden, I presume. The man did not blink. Follow me. We entered into a cavernous foyer whose walls were lined with portraits of long dead Marshalseas, each more severe and hollow-eyed than the last. There was no carpet to soften our steps, only cold flagstone beneath our boots and the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock echoing through the silence. Holmes's gaze darted around the chamber. No signs of recent habitation, he muttered under his breath. And yet the hearth is warm. Ramsden led us down a dim corridor where the gas lamps burned with a sickly yellow light, and the smell of damp wood and old incense hung heavy in the air. "You will be quartered in the east wing," he said. "Breakfast is served at 7. The master does not receive visitors before noon." "Curious custom for someone who summoned us," Holmes remarked. But Ramsden had already turned and disappeared into the gloom. The rooms were as Clara had described them, large, shadowy spaces, adorned with high curtained windows, dusty four-posters, and antique furniture left in a state of somber dignity. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and faint stains marked the wood around the fireplace, as though time itself had left behind a bruise. Holmes wasted no time. As I settled my bag near the bed, he moved about the chamber with the energy of a cat set loose in a new hunting ground. He ran his fingers along the mantel, examined the floorboards for signs of recent movement, and crouched to study a faint set of scuff marks near the door. "We are being observed," he said at last. "But not openly. They want to see how we behave before they show themselves." He stood, dusted his hands, and crossed to the desk in the corner. On it sat a small black volume bound in what looked suspiciously like leather too supple for common use. The spine bore no title. Holmes opened it cautiously. Inside, handwritten in an elegant and slanted hand, were a series of entries dated decades prior. Sermons, rituals, references to the doctrine of tolling. The text grew increasingly erratic as it progressed, sentences scratched out and rewritten, words underlined with obsessive fervor. "It's a ledger," Holmes murmured, "and a confession, written in the hand of Rowan Marshalsea himself. He showed me one entry dated November 3rd, 1876. He has rung the bell thrice. The sin is known, and thus I must bear the toll. Let the hand strike at midnight, when the sins of blood cry loudest. No absolution without reckoning. The ritual cannot be silenced, only delayed." Before I could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Clara peeked inside, her face pale. "There's something you should see in the drawing-room," she said. We followed her through a narrow hall into what must once have been the heart of the home. The drawing-room had the air of a place. Forgotten furniture covered in linen shrouds, the fireplace long cold. But upon the mantel, someone had recently placed 3 framed photographs. Holmes approached, his brows knitting. The first was Rowan Marshalsea, stern and angular, with eyes like dark glass. The second was Edward, familiar and noble of bearing, even in his youth. The third was a child, perhaps 8 or 9, a boy we had never seen before. He bore a passing resemblance to Edward, though his eyes were lighter and his smile unsettling. "Who is he?" I asked. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I thought there were only 2 sons." Holmes examined the back of the photograph. It bore a name, written in faded ink. "Thaddeus." "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "we have found the ghost in the family tree." "What does that mean?" "It means there was another heir," Holmes said, "one erased from the official narrative. And if he is still alive, it changes everything." Before we could discuss it further, the clock struck noon. A heavy knock echoed through the hallway. Ramsden appeared again, this time holding a silver tray upon which rested 3 black envelopes. "Master requests your presence," he said, "at midnight. The threshold room." He handed each of us an envelope and departed without a word. Holmes opened his immediately. Inside was a single card. "The toll has been struck. The blood remembers. The hour of reckoning draws near." Holmes looked up, his voice low and grave. "We are being summoned, Watson, not for conversation, but for judgment." Clara's hands trembled as she held her envelope. She didn't open it. "I remember the threshold room," she said. "It's not on any of the maps of the house. But once, when I was very young, I followed Edward through the hall, beyond the chapel. He opened a narrow door behind the statue of St. Matthias. It led down to a crypt, I guessed," she nodded. "We didn't go far. He turned back after a minute. He said it didn't feel right, like something was breathing down there." Holmes's face was grim. "Then tonight we descend." As the light dimmed and the sky grew heavy with rain, Holmes began preparations in earnest. He borrowed oil lanterns from the cellar, packed a satchel with a pistol, spare bullets, and a length of rope. I armed myself as well reluctantly, but prudently. At precisely midnight, the clock began to chime. We stood together in the upper hall, the 3 of us silent. As the final toll rang out, Holmes turned to us and said, "This house is not haunted, Watson. It is inhabited by ritual, by memory, and by a darkness not of the supernatural, but of the soul." Then he opened the door and led us into the shadows beyond. Section 6. The threshold room. Midnight hung like a blade over Blackthorn Hall, its edge drawn along the skin of silence. Outside, the rain had begun to fall lightly at first, then steadily, a cold and constant drumming against the windows. The sound seemed to heighten the stillness within, amplifying every creak of floorboard and distant groan of settling stone. Holmes led the way, lantern in hand, the flame trembling against the walls like a prisoner's breath. Clara followed closely behind, her face pale but composed, the black envelope still unopened in her hand. I brought up the rear, my revolver discreetly tucked in my coat pocket. My heart thudding in time with our footsteps, we descended the main staircase into the rear corridor of the house, then turned toward the chapel. As we passed to the drawing room, the portraits on the walls seemed to lean inward slightly, as though the Marshalsea ancestors themselves were watching our passage with silent anticipation. At the far end of the corridor, just before the chapel door, Holmes stopped and turned to Clara. "You're certain of what you saw?" he asked. "The statue of St. Matthias?" Clara nodded. "It was years ago, but I remember the way Edward moved it, just slightly, to the left. There's a panel hidden in the base." Holmes examined the statue with great care. It was a tall figure in robes, holding a great iron-bound book, and a broken axe, his martyr's symbol. The base was octagonal and cracked in several places. Holmes ran his hands along the edge until he found a groove, then applied gentle pressure. With him, a soft grind of stone on stone, the panel shifted. Behind it lay a wooden door, nearly lost in shadow. Its surface bore no handle, no markings, only the faint indentation of a bell in the upper center. Holmes reached forward and pressed against it. The door swung inward with an eerie groan, revealing a narrow staircase plunging into darkness. "We descend," he said, lifting his lantern. The stairs were steep and winding, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. Damp air clung to our skin as we moved lower, the scent of earth and mildew growing stronger. At the bottom, the passage widened into a corridor lined with thick wooden beams. Mold crept along the edges, and tiny rivulets of water trickled along. The stone floor dot after some distance, we arrived at a rusted gate. Holmes tested it. It was unlocked. Beyond lay a vaulted chamber, round and windowless, lit only by a single brazier in the center. Its walls were carved with strange symbols, bells, flames, and what looked like eyes, hundreds of them, etched in irregular spirals. "This is it," Clara whispered. "The threshold room." In the center of the chamber stood a stone plinth, upon which rested a second bell larger than the one in the chapel, yet smaller than the great St. Dunstan's bell. It was made of black iron and bore a series of runes around its base. Holmes approached it cautiously. "There's something ceremonial about this," he said. "See here the grooves worn into the floor around the pedestal? This bell has been rung many times." Clara stepped forward and ran a finger over the nearest etching. "I remember when my uncle died, Edward told me he heard the bell ring. Once at midnight, just once, and that was how he knew the old man was dead." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A death knell? A family tradition? Or something more? He turned back to the chamber and began examining its walls in detail. Along one side he discovered a low bench carved into the stone above it, a set of hooks, now empty. A rusted chain hung from one, and a single black robe remained folded neatly below. "I believe this was once a place of judgment," Holmes murmured. "Not a chapel, an inner sanctum, reserved for rites passed from generation to generation. And this," he pointed to a groove running from the plinth to a small hole in the wall.